Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Gimel, and Yirtz Hashem, today we will be learning Daf Kufay Beis Amid Beis. We're beginning with the new Siman today on the very bottom line of Kufay Beis Amid Aleph, Siman Shin Lamed Aleph, Din Milah B'Shabbos, the halachas that govern performing a bris milah on Shabbos, Ubo Yud Seifim, and here we have 10 Seifim. Our learning today should be a schos for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasuna Bar Tzara Bar Shivya, Ha'im Dem Bei Bayamu Bein Bayabasha, Hamakoim Yerachem Alehem, V'Yitziyeh Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagala of Izman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schos Refuah Shalema for Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chana, for Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha, Chavadasa Basera Rivka Bashira Leah, and for Gila Shifra Bas Ilana Udal. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sai Shar Chayla Yisrael. And as usual, we are mispal that B'schus the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael B'chol Makom Shehem. And I want to be wishing everyone a Gemar Chasima Tova and a good gebenched yar. So, Siman Shin Lamed Aleph, Din Milah B'Shabbos, Ubo Yud Seifim, says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Oisim Kol Tzarchei Milah B'Shabbos. The halacha is that bris milah is doiche Shabbos. So on Shabbos, you are allowed to perform every part of the bris milah. And the Mechaber spells it out. He says, Mayalin, you could do the actual milah. Upairin, you could perform priya. We'll discuss that in a moment. Umoitzitzin, and you could perform metzitza. We'll discuss that also in a moment. V'noistin alav kamain, and you could put cumin onto the incision site of the bris milah. This is something that they did back in the day as a curative. They would take ground cumin and they would put ground cumin over the wound of the bris milah. Now, just a little bit of background for those that are completely uninitiated in the exact procedure of a bris milah. The three parts of milah that the Mechaber mentions over here are mayalin, that's the milah itself, pairin, what we call priya, and moitzitzin, what we call metzitza. What are these? Well, when you perform a bris milah, the first thing that you have to do is you need to remove the ar hamila itself, the orla. You have to remove the foreskin in English. Now, that's a piece of skin that covers over. It acts kind of as a hood. It's a piece of skin which you could actually, when somebody does not have a bris milah, when somebody has an orla, it's a layer of skin that actually covers up the tip of the aver. It could be pulled up so that it actually completely covers the tip of the aver, or it could be drawn down. It's relatively loose. It kind of is a piece of skin that goes up over the tip, folds back in, and it's connected by the corona, what we know, well, most people call the HaTorah, but we'll have to describe that in detail as well. Now, the first part of the bris milah, you need to remove that or ha'orla. So they draw, if you've ever watched a bris milah, you'll see that contemporary Moelim, basically what they do is they squeeze down from the tip and they draw that orla skin up. They put on a clamp. In a way, an easy way to think about it is if you envision a grape, but basically what they're doing is like this. They're taking the ar ha'orla over here, they're pinching it up, right? So that now the gid itself, the aver itself is squeezed down. The flap of orla skin now has nothing inside it. And then they take a clamp and they put a clamp on it like this, so that the aver itself is down, it's not inside that skin. And then they take the knife and they slice across, and that's how they cut off the orla itself. But then, underneath the orla, there's what's called the ar hapriya. The ar hapriya is a very thin membrane, and the ar hapriya also has to be removed so that it's not covering up the HaTorah. It's not covering up the top of the aver. So a certain amount of it gets cut off, usually together with the orla. A certain amount of it, the moil will tear one side of it and then peel it downwards. It's not as thick as the orla itself. It's a thin membrane. So you could tear it and then you could pull it downwards. That is the priya. Very often by a bris, you'll see that the moil will cut the arla, then he'll do the priya, and then if you have a chashav, a paisik, a rav, or a rosh yeshiva who's the sandik, they'll look and they'll say, niskala HaTorah? Is the HaTorah revealed? Have I completely uncovered the HaTorah? I removed the arla successfully, and I took down the ar hapriya successfully, so that it's niskalsa HaTorah. That's the goal of the milah, niskalsa HaTorah. The entire HaTorah has to be uncovered. So the Mechaber says you could do both the milah itself, cutting the arla, and the priya, tearing and peeling down or cutting off the ara priya. You could do that on Shabbos as well. Now, in both of those, there is a chiddush in halacha. The chiddush in halacha is that the milah itself definitely causes bleeding. So the cutting of the arla itself is definitely netilas neshama. That is definitely chayvel. That's causing a wound on Shabbos. That's one of the lamites. Well, it's a tolada of netilas neshama. Priya also can definitely cause bleeding. Is it a psik reisha for priya to cause bleeding? I'm not sure. But definitely, I'm not a moil, but definitely cutting or tearing the ara priya can also cause bleeding, which would make it also chayvel. But you're allowed to do that as well. And lastly, the Mechaber said u'moitzitzin. You're allowed to perform mitzitza. What is mitzitza? A lot more people are they're at least aware of what mitzitza is because of all the controversies that there have been over the centuries over mitzitza bepeh. And that is, halacha states that the moil has to go ahead and actually suck the site of the wound in order to draw the blood out. Now, in halachic literature, there is a question: is that mitzitza done because it's necessary for the proper care of the wound? Is it to prevent infection? Is it because it's a form of cleaning the wound, and if you don't do the mitzitza, the baby is in sakana? Now, if that's the case, then the mitzitza would seem not to be so much an intrinsic part of the milah process. It's not necessarily part of the mitzvahs hamilah. Or there are others that say, no, mitzitza bepeh is an actual intrinsic part of the mitzvah of milah. You need the arla, you need to take care of the ara priya, and you need to do mitzitza. Over here, now, mitzitza also is going to involve chayvel, and it's also going to be a telada of netilas neshama. Why? Because when you do mitzitza, it's stated that when you do mitzitza, you've got to do it hard enough that you draw blood out. So you're not only, it's not that you made the cut and now whatever blood was released is released, and when you do mitzitza, you're not drawing any more blood out of the flesh. No, you are specifically with intent drawing blood that is absorbed in the flesh. That is part and parcel of mitzitza. And that's why the Mechaber tells us over here, the Mechaber has to tell you that you're allowed to do mitzitza as well. So again, to wrap up this sif, the Mechaber tells us, Bris Milah is Doicha Shabbos. Since Bris Milah is Doicha Shabbos, you could do Mayalin, you could do the Me'ilah, the Milah. Certainly doing the Milah is Chayvel. You're allowed to do it on Shabbos. Pyrin, you're allowed to do the Priya, even though that could also cause Haitzaz Dam. It could also be Chayvel. You're allowed to do that also. U'moitzitzin, and you're allowed to perform Mitzitza, even though Mitzitza is also going to be Chayvel, because you are going to extract Dam that is absorbed in the flesh. And lastly, you're allowed to put Kamoin onto the site of the wound, even though this would entail an Issa D'Rabbanan, because you're doing something for refuah purposes, and there should be a Gzera Mishum Shchikas Samamonim. There is no such Gzera. Obviously, if you're allowed to perform Yisurei Daraisa, obviously you could perform an Issa D'Rabbanan of putting on Kamoin. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Aleph, how do we know that Milah is Doicha Shabbos? Says the Mishnah Berurah Diksiv, Uba Yoim Hashmini Yimoil Besar Arlosai. Ubayom Hashmini, and on the 8th day after a boy is born, Yimoil Besar Arlosai, you perform a bris milah. Now the word Ubayom is really extra. The pasuk could have said Ubashmini, and on the 8th day. The psukim over there in Tazria are talking about counting days. So the pasuk could have just said Ubashmini, and on day 8, Yimoil Besar Arlosai. But that's not what the pasuk says. The pasuk says Ubayoim hashmini, and on the eighth day. So the word ubayoim is extra. The Gemara darshans bayoim afilu b'Shabbos. That extra word is there to teach us that Mila is doicha Shabbos. Ice cotton bezu moitzitzin, you're allowed to perform mitzitza. Afal gav dal yidei mitzitza hadam nitak mechiburoi. Even though when you do mitzitza, you are going to draw blood out of the flesh itself. V'havi leichayvel. And therefore, mitzitza is considered the malacha of chayvel. Afal pikein, moitzitzin, you still do mitzitza. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is very interesting. The Mishnah Berurah says, why is the mitzitza doicha Shabbos? Mishum de sakana lovlad kishala yimoy tzadam. He quotes the Gemara Shabbos Kuflam and Gimel Amud Beis that says the reason mitzitza is doicha Shabbos is because of sakana. So from that Gemara, it's mashma that it's not doicha Shabbos because it's part and parcel of Mila. It's doicha Shabbos because it's a question of sakana. So you're dealing with a chayla sheyesh by sakana. A chayla sheyesh by sakana, obviously you're allowed to do whatever you need to do. So that's what would come out from this Mishnah Berurah. And again, this is a very complex sugya. Going to Iskat and Gimel says the Mishnah Berurah, Kamain, you're allowed to put cumin on the wound. Hayadarkam, it was the way back in the day, in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, Laseis min bisamim shachok l'refua, where they would put some kind of a ground spice like cumin onto the site of the Mila wound for refuah purposes. V'huadin laseis espalanis tachbaishes al hamila. You're also allowed to put a bandage onto the wound of the bris milah. Again, this is an action that you're doing for refuah. It is something that theoretically could have been also because of shrikas samemanim, but again, bris milah is doicha Shabbos for daraisis. It's certainly doicha Shabbos in the context of an iser d'rabbanan. V'ayla kamon b'siv zayin. Take a look later in siv zayin, says the Chavetz Chaim. Imloi hoyoloi kamain shachuk. What do you do if you don't have ground cumin? Are you allowed to actually go ahead and grind it on Shabbos? We'll discuss that later on in Sif Zayin. Moving along to Sif Beis, says the Mechaber, top line of Kufayin Beis Amud Beis. So, we now know that you're allowed to perform the bris milah on Shabbos. Now, when you perform a bris milah, you are removing skin that is attached at the top of the aver. You're removing this skin, and you're uncovering the tip of the aver. Now, how much skin are you required to remove in order for the bris milah to be a good bris milah, right? It's not just you snip whatever you snip. There's a certain amount of skin that you must remove. And high level, you must uncover the HaTorah. Now, we're going to have to discuss precisely what part of the tip of the aver is called the HaTorah, but you must uncover the HaTorah. If you don't, you haven't performed an acceptable bris milah. Now, if the moil goes ahead and he removes some of the skin, but he doesn't remove all of it, so then we look at it and there are pieces of skin left that are problematic, and there may be pieces of skin left that are not problematic. And in halacha, we refer to these as tzitzin hama'akvin. Tzitzin are strips of skin. So there are tzitzin hama'akvin es hamila. There are strips of skin that if you left them there, you didn't make a bris milah. So they're ma'akev the milah. If you leave those pieces of skin, you haven't made an effective halachically acceptable bris milah, and bris milah not accomplished, you still have to remove those strips of skin. Then there are tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. Then sometimes you could leave a strip of skin, but that's a strip of skin which maybe ultimately you want to remove it because maybe he'll look funny, so maybe you want to remove that piece. It's something that really should have been removed, but if you didn't remove it, it's not ma'akev the milah. The milah is still an acceptable bris milah. Now the question over here is, when we're talking about performing a bris milah on Shabbos, so when you cut the skin, you're doing the issa malacha of chayvel. You're doing an issa daraisa. So what happens if the moil does the bris milah and he leaves over some strips of skin that should have been removed? Now, if he leaves over tzitzin hama'akvin, if he leaves over strips of skin that they must be removed, otherwise it's not a kosher or bris milah, so then we understand, oh, okay, go back and take them off. The same way the first cutting that you did for the bris milah was doicha Shabbos, you haven't made a bris milah yet because of those tzitzin amakvin. So it's very easy for us to understand. Yes, if there are tzitzin amakvin, you have to go back and you have to remove them. But what if he made a bris milah that is halachically acceptable, and he left over strips of skin, but they're tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin? Those tzitzin, technically speaking, they could remain there, and the bris milah is a kosher bris milah. Are you allowed to go back and remove those tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin? Now, your knee-jerk reaction would be, no, of course not. How could you go ahead and perform the Issa Darais of Chayvel in order to remove tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin? What heter would there be? That's not part of the bris milah. You already did the bris milah. That would be your knee-jerk reaction. We're going to see in the Mechaber, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, Kol zman shelo silek yodai min hamilah, as long as the moil is still busy working with his hands, with the bris milah, he has not finished. He hasn't removed his hands from the bris milah. Chayzer, he could go back and he could continue cutting afilu al tzitzon she'enon ma'akvin. So nowadays they use that clamp and very quickly they make a slit, they make a cut, and they remove the arla. They didn't always have that clamp. So let's say when the moil is making the bris milah, let's say a bris milah takes several cuts. Maybe you don't get everything off in one cut. So maybe he made one cut, and then he made a second cut, and by the time he finished the second cut, he removed everything that's ma'akiv. At this point, the bris milah is a kosher bris milah. But there still are tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. There are still strips left that are not ma'akiv. Is he allowed to continue cutting? Says the Mechaber, yes. If he's still working, if he hasn't removed his hands from the bris milah, if he's still working, he could continue cutting even to remove tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. Now, what's the rationale for that? The rationale for it is that it's all considered to be part of the initial action. We don't look at it that, oh, you made cut number 1, and then you made cut number 2, and when you finished cut number 2, you finished the bris milah, because the only thing that's left now is tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin, and now when you go on to cut number 3, you're starting a new act of chayvel, and you're doing chayvel that's not really included under the rubric of bris milah, and now you're doing chayvel be'isser. You have no heter to do this chayvel. We don't look at it that way. As long as he didn't take his hands away from the milah and he's still working, everything that he's doing is part and parcel of the initial cutting and the initial bris milah that is doicha Shabbos. So that's why the Mechaber says, as long as he hasn't taken his hand away from the milah, chayzer, he's allowed to go back and continue cutting, afilu al tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin, even if now he's going to cut tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. Says the Mishnah Berurah cutting down with chayzer, da'af de garma lach doicha orla, because even though at this point he has already cut off enough of the arla that the kid is considered gemalt, he already has a bris milah. Ubedieved yotze yidei mitzvahs milah afilu b'lo yelu atzitzin. And now b'dieved, there's already a bris milah here. It's not lechatchila, because lechatchila you're supposed to remove those tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin, but they're tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. So b'dieved, if we stop right now, there's a kosher bris milah. Mikamokim, nevertheless, so long as he hasn't taken his hands away, mikri kilachatchila, it's considered that he's still doing the same initial act. He's still doing. Look at it this way. We don't tell the moil that when you're cutting for the bris milah, you're mechuyev to stop cutting the instant you get to the point where now everything else is tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. Right? Why? Because it's all one act of bris milah, and that act of bris milah is doicha Shabbos. So too, you didn't take your hand away, you could go ahead and still make a new cut to remove tzitzin, even if they're tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. The kula chadam ilsi, it's all considered one act. The nitna Shabbos litchei setzla, and Shabbos is nitche in front of bris milah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, take a look at the Chedush Aran Shekosova writes, even if the moil already took his hand away from the cutting of the of the milah, the arla, so again, this is step number 2. He already did the cut to cut off the arla. Now he put down the knife and he's going to take the Arapriya to tear the Arapriya and pull the Arapriya down. So is that called Silek Yodoi? Is that called, oh, you finished the cutting, so now you can't go back to cut tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin? The Ran says no. Even if he already finished cutting and now he's working on priya, mikri adayin lo silek yadai min amila. That means he's still occupied in the mila. And since he's still occupied in the mila, he could still take the knife and cut off even tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin. The mila priya chadamilsi, because the Ran says mila, priya, it's all part of the same mila that is doicha Shabbos. But if he cut the arla and he took care of the ara priya, so he's finished cutting, he's finished working on the skin of the arla and of the priya. He finished working those two sections of the act of mila, and now the only thing that he still has to do is the mitzitza, sucking out the dam. Mistapik sham imutter b'Shabbos lachza l'tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. Then already the Ran is mesupik whether now he's allowed to go back to cut off tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. What would the shaila be? Because really you're already done. So you're done with the cutting, all the work of the skin on the aver that has to do with bris milah. You're already finished. You finished the milah, you finished the priya, you only have mitzitza left. To now go back and do a new cutting, there the Ran is already mesupik. Maybe that would be usher. The Dilma HaMetzitza Nikri Rak Refuah V'Lo Tzarech Mila. And one of the reasons the Ran is mesupik is because, again, this suffix that we spoke about earlier, is the Metzitza really an intrinsic part of the mitzvah of Mila? Or is the Metzitza just something that you have to do because if you don't do it, the baby is in sakana? If it's part of the mitzvah of Mila, so then okay. Yes, you finished the Mila, you finished the Priya, but you're still involved in the Mitzitza, so you're still involved in the mitzvah of Mila. The mitzvah of Mila is Doicha Shabbos. You could still go back and cut off even Tzitza She'eina Ma'akvin. But if the Mitzitza is not really part of the mitzvah, if the Mitzitza is just something that you have to do to protect the well-being of the baby, then really the Mila you finished already. You did the Mila, you did the Priya, you're done. The Mitzitza, okay, now you took off your Moil hat and you put on your doctor hat. But now to go back for tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin, maybe you can't. Ayin sham. Ulafizeh, and according to this, says the Mishnah Berurah, Pashit, it's obvious. Da'afilu ima peireyahu acher. What if there were mechabit two people for this bris milah? They had two moilim. One moil did the milah, he cut off the arla, and the next one is doing the ara priya. The next one is going to take care of the ara priya. So now, could somebody go back to cut off tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin? So moil number one did the milah. He cut the arla. Now he steps away. Now moil number two came and he's doing the priya. Now they realize that there are tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. Could you still go back for tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin? So it says the Mishnah Berurah, yeah. Kol zman shu oisik b'mitzvasa mutar lo l'rishain lazer v'lingmar tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. You see what the Mishnah Berurah is saying? Again, moil number one cut the arla. Then he put down the knife. He steps aside. Moil number two came and he did the priya. Now moil number one looks and he says, you know what? This tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. Now moil number one wants to take the knife and cut off the tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. He took his hands off the milah already. Yeah, but even though he took his hands off the milah already, moil number two was still doing the priya. So since moil number two is still doing the priya, moil number one could come back and he could take care of the tzitzin she'enan ma'akvin. We don't care that moil number one took his hand away from the milah. Because the bottom line is, the mitzvah of milah was not yet completed, because moil number two was still working on the priya. Ice cut hay, and you could do this afilo al tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin. What are tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin? Hainu ritzuos, these are strips of skin. Hainu ritzui shel basar shenisharu, these are strips of skin of the arla that remained in place, that he failed to cut off. Bein meha arla ubein me or shepereya. When we talk about tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin, it could be part of the skin of the arla, or it could be part of the ar hapriya. Either way, it's something that you would go back for. Ois cut and vav, hama'akvin, we're talking about tzitzin that are ma'akiv, tzitzin that are not ma'akiv. No, we didn't do that yet. Okay, let's go back to the mechaber. Says the Mechaber, end of the top line. So until now we discussed what the halacha is if the moil has not yet taken his hands away from the milah. But how about if he did? How about if the moil went? He did the milah, he cut off the arla, he did the priya, and he looks at the sandik, and he says, Niskal Sahar Torah? And the sandik says, yes. And he puts down the knife, takes his hands away, then he looks and he says, uh-oh, I missed some tzitzin over there. So now he's done. He's finished. Says the Mechaber, Silek Yadai, if he already takes his hands away, so he finished the milah, so to speak, Einoi Chayzer Ela Al Tzitzin Hama'akvin. Then he's not allowed to go back to cut off remaining strips of skin only if they're tzitzin hama'akvin. If they're tzitzin hama'akvin, if there's strips that must be removed in order for it to be a kosher milah, then he's allowed to go back because bris milah is like a Shabbos. But if it's tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin, he can't go ahead and go back because now he's doing a new act. The original act of doing the bris milah was completed. He did it and he stopped. He took his hands away. He finished. He's done. And it's a kosher milah. He can't go now, pick up a knife again, and start working on tzitzin she'enon ma'akvin. He's doing chayva on Shabbos without a heter. Now the Mechaber says, Ve'elu heina ma'akvin, what are these tzitzin that are ma'akiv? So the Mechaber translates it very high level, and we're not learning Yeridea, we're learning Arachayim. The Mechaber says, Basar ha'choife, this would be strips that cover, afilu roiv gava shel HaTorah b'makom echad. Even strips of skin that cover the majority of the height of the HaTorah, even in one place. Okay, what does this mean? Well, let's grab something that I could use to point. Okay, so we're going to imagine that my finger over here is the aver abris, right? So here you have the tip, right? There's the tip. Let's say you have a strip of skin that is still connected, and it covers, it's one narrow strip of skin going up towards the tip. And it covers most of the height of the HaTorah. Now, what exactly is the HaTorah? The question of what exactly is the HaTorah is the subject of a major machlokes. We'll go with the simple pshat right now, that the HaTorah is called the tip of the aver. There's a corona, there's a ridge that goes around. It's not all the way at the tip of the aver abris. It's a little bit down, I don't know, let's say a quarter of an inch or half an inch down from the tip. There's a ridge that goes around. So one sheet is that the HaTorah is everything from that ridge all the way up to the tip. So let's say you have a narrow strip of skin that is just a strip going up. If it covers the majority of the height of the HaTorah, even though it's very narrow, maybe it's only 1/8 of an inch wide, so it's only in one spot, there's a strip of skin going up, and it covers most of the height of the HaTorah, that is tzitzin hama'akvin. And that is something that has to be removed in order for it to be a kosher bris milah. So those are the words of the Mechaber over here. Elu hein hama'akvin, what are tzitzin hama'akvin? Basar ha'choifa, a strip that covers afilu roiv gava shel HaTorah b'makom echad. Even if it only covers most of the height of the HaTorah, b'makom echad, only a narrow strip in one place. Now what's the afilu? The afilu is, because in this case that we just described, it's a narrow strip of skin covering most of the height of the HaTorah b'makom echad. Another possibility would be, what if he cut the Or HaOrla, but he didn't cut it all the way down to the ridge? So now you have a strip that goes around. Most of the height of the Orla was cut off, but you have a strip that's remaining low down, and that strip is going around roiv of the circumference, roiv of the hekif of the HaTorah. That would certainly be tzitzin hama'akvin. Says the Mishnah Berurah. When we talk about tzitzin hama'akvin, gam kein bein b'milah ubein b'priya v'chanal. When we talk about tzitzin hama'akvin, you could have tzitzin hama'akvin by the skin of the orla itself. You could also have tzitzin hama'akvin on the or hapriya. The words of the Mechaber were afilu roiv gava. Even if you have a strip that's covering most of the height of the HaTorah, b'makom echad, The koshkin roiv hakefa shel HaTorah. Certainly, if you have a strip that's going around most of the circumference of the HaTorah, that's certainly a problem. Afal pisha ain't a roiv goiva, even if it's not covering most of the height. In other words, he cut off most of the height of the HaTorah, but there's a narrow strip left going around. If it's going around roiv of the hekef of the HaTorah, that is certainly tzitzin hama'akvin. Vayin b'Yeridei Siman Reis Samatal b'Beis Yosef u'B'Shach. Vayin Sham b'Achreinim shenispar ma nikra HaTorah. In Yeridei, we should all be zeicher to sit down and learn Yeridei the same way we've learned Arachayim. In Yeridei, in Hilchas Bris Milah, over there you learn the machlokes of what exactly is called the HaTorah. And very high level, the question is the HaTorah the way I described it to you? It's from the ridge to the tip. That whole section is called the HaTorah. Or is the HaTorah the ridge itself? It could be that the HaTorah is just the ridge itself, or it could be like from a little bit beyond the ridge, from the bottom of the ridge to the top of the ridge. Is that whole part called the HaTorah? Okay. Now we go to Sif Gimel, says the Mechaber. Ben Shmoina. Now, when you're discussing Bris Milah and you see the words Ben Shmoina, right away you think it means 8 days. That's not what it means. Over here it means months. Ben Shmoina, if you have an 8-month baby, and this is something we've discussed already several times, that back in the day an 8-month baby was not considered to be viable. So, Ben Shmoina, if you have an 8-month baby, you don't really want to do a Bris Milah on Shabbos. This is not a viable baby. How are you going to do chayvel on Shabbos on a baby that you're assuming, unfortunately, is going to be a nafil, is going to die? This is not a viable baby. You're going to be machal Shabbos to go do a bris milah on a baby that's nebach kemes? You're not going to do that. Says the Mechaber Ben Shmoina, if it's an 8-month baby, well, now it depends. You got to take a hard look at the baby. Im gamru sa'aroi v'tziparnav, if he has hair and he has nails, Molino Yisai b'Shabbos. You're allowed to do the bris milah on Shabbos, even though he's an 8-month baby. But you're still allowed to do the bris milah. Why? The Mishnah Berurah is going to explain. Because we assume that he's not really an 8-month baby. He's a 7th-month baby. A 7-month baby could survive. A 7-month baby is viable. If it's a 7-month baby, why was it born in the 8th month? This is a concept that we learned about earlier. It's a 7th-month baby, shenishta. It's a 7th-month baby that came out late. Somehow, whatever exactly that means. But if you see that there's hair and you see that there are nails, that means it's a 7th-month baby, not an 8-month baby. So even though according to your calculations, this is an 8-month baby, hair and nails, you go ahead and you do a bris milah on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chesim Gamru, Da'afta ben Shmoina ba'al malav bar kayamahu. Even though normally we assume that an 8th-month baby is not viable, and according to all calculations, this baby is an 8th-month baby. Bazesh Gamru, by this baby who has hair and nails, Arena we say, Hi bar shivu. This is really a 7th-month baby. And for some reason, this baby remained in the womb all the time. Okay, says the Mechaber weiter. V'im loy gamru, third line down, about the middle of the line. V'im loy gamru, if you have a baby that's an 8-month baby and there is no hair and there is no nails, afilu imi safik ben shiva safik ben shmoina. Even if according to the calculations you have a suffix, you're not sure. This baby might be a 7th-month baby. He might be an 8th-month baby. When you look at the woman's calendar and she knows when she had relations with her husband, there's room for a doubt over here. It could be that this baby is a 7th-month baby, but there's no hair, there's no nails. We have a suffix. Is it a ben shiva? Is it a ben shmoina? Ein molin Yisai b'Shabbos. You can't make the bris milah on Shabbos because we're not going to do a milah on Shabbos misafik. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Safik ben Shiva, V'huadin Safik ben Shmoina, Safik ben Tisha. You could also have the suffix the other way. The baby was born, and according to the calculations of the parents, we don't know it's a suffix if it's an 8th-month baby or a 9th-month baby. But again, on the side that it's an 8-month baby, we don't expect the baby to survive. And there's no hair and there's no nails. So you want to do a bris milah on Shabbos and do chayvel on Shabbos misafik? You can't do that. We're not going to do chil Shabbos misafik. Continues the Mechaber, Ve'ein tzarich loimer ben shmoina vadai. Certainly, if we know for certain that this is an 8-month baby, we're not doing a bris milah on Shabbos. Ve'emu ben shiva vadai. Now, if it's a vadai that the baby is a 7th-month baby, then I feel like Amru Sarev Yitzirpanam Malanaisai. If we know bevadai that this is a 7th-month baby, now how do we know bevadai that the baby is a 7th-month baby? Very simple. We know when she had relations with her husband. And we know that she didn't have relations with her husband after that. So it's definitely not a 6-month baby. We also know that she didn't have relations with her husband, let's say, for 2 months before that, or 3 months before that. So we know it's not an 8th-month baby or a 9th-month baby. The only the way this baby has to be a 7th-month baby. If we know b'vadai that the baby is a 7th-month baby, then even if there's no hair and there's no nails, a 7th-month baby is considered viable. So since it's considered viable, then go ahead. Molanaisai. You do the bris milah, v'ayin b'yaridei siman reish samach vav, says the Mishnah Berurah. Oiskan yod ben shiva vadai. If we're dealing with a vadai 7th-month baby, hainu shabal oisa, we know that they had relations, uperash, and then they separated. Doesn't mean that they separated in the context of a get. It means that they didn't have relations after that. So we know, we could look at the calendar. We know they had relations on that night. And they didn't have relations after that. So it can't be a 6-month baby. She didn't have relations later than that. We also know, and this the Mishnah Berurah doesn't mention, we also know that she didn't have relations a month or 2 preceding that. So we know it's not an 8th-month baby or a 9th-month baby. So we know it's a 7th-month baby. But the Mishnah Berurah warns. When do we say that a baby is a vadai 7th-month baby? Only in the scenario that we discussed, where we could look at a calendar and they say, look, we know when we had relations. That's when we could say it's a vadai 7th-month baby. But not if you look at the calendar, the woman goes to the doctor and they say, when's the last time you had your period? So we're not going to go calculate and say that it's a vadai 7th-month baby because she didn't see dam since then, or we know that we had relations on the night that she went to the mikveh, leil tefillah. Leil tefillah is a time that very often a woman becomes expectant because it's the beginning of her cycle, so that's when she's the most fertile. No, those calculations don't hold water in halacha to decide whether or not you could be machal Shabbos, because they are not a hechacha berurah. Okay. Ois katan yud aleph. The parentheses sent us to Yeridei Siman Reish Samach Vav. Says the Mishnah Berurah V'ayin b'Yeridei the Shabavur Das Ramah. There's a fascinating Ramah in Siman Reish Samach Vav. Fascinating Ramah. The Shabavur Das Ramah. Over there we have the opinion of the Ramah, who says the Safik ben Shmoina or ben Shiva. When we have a baby that's a Safik 7th month or 8th month. So again, 7th month considered viable. You do a bris milah even if there's no hair, no nails. 8th month, not considered viable, unless there's hair and nails. If there's hair and nails, not really an 8th-month baby, really a 7th-month baby. Now you have a baby, it's a suffix. We don't know. Is it a ben shiva or a ben shmeina? And there's no hair and there's no nails. So we don't know what to do with this baby. Says the Ramah, afilu loy nigmar sarav itziparnav, even if there's no hair and no nails, molin b'Shabbos. You're going to do a bris milah on Shabbos, miman of shach. What's the miman of shach? Di bar milahu shaper moil. Let's do the math. We have a baby. We don't know. Is it a 7th-month baby or an 8th-month baby? Well, if the baby is a 7th-month baby, we're allowed to do the milah on Shabbos, right? Because viable baby, milah is doicha Shabbos, we're allowed to do the milah. Now, you're worried maybe the baby's an 8th-month baby. Oh, if the baby's an 8th-month baby, then you're not allowed to do the milah. Why? Because you're being machal Shabbos on a non-viable baby. Why are you being machal Shabbos? Because you're doing chayvel. When you cut, you're going to extract dam, you're doing chayvel. Says the Ramah, no, not so fast. If the baby is a 7th-month baby, so then what you did was good. Milah is doicha Shabbos. V'iloi, and if he's an 8th-month baby, so he's not viable, mechatech b'basa b'almahu. So you didn't do chayvel. You cut what is essentially a dead baby. Because he's oimid l'misa. You're telling me he's not a viable baby. You're telling me that halachically, he's kemes. right? Because you're telling me can't do a bris milah. Why can't you do a bris milah? Because the milah is not Doicha Shabbos. Why isn't it Doicha Shabbos? Because you're not doing a real milah. You're doing a milah on a mace. What do you mean? The baby's breathing. No, but halachically, we look at this baby as being a mace. Well, if halachically we look at this baby as being a mace, why can't I cut? That's not the Isser Darais of Chayvel. Cutting a dead person is not Chayvel. And you're telling me that halachically we look at this baby as being dead. So says the Ramah, Savik ben Shevis, Savik ben Shemaina. Go ahead, do a bris milah. Vein bazem mishum chabura, gave it to Heaven Eiffel. V'inei babach, the Taz, daita lusay kashulchan aruch, the Bach and the Taz don't paskin like that, Ramah. They paskin like the Mechaber. Avobel Yerada Hevi b'shem Sefer Lechem Mishnah, sha'aminig lamol sveikos, that the minig is to do milah on sveikos. V'gam be'irik sivo b'yom hashmini koy. Now, halacha l'maisa, the truth is that we don't follow these rules, halacha l'maisa. We don't worry about preemies. We don't make calculations. Is it a 6-month baby, a 7th-month baby, an 8th-month baby? We don't make any of these calculations. Why? Because again, like I've spoken out many times over the last several days, due to advances in medicine and in advances in technology, we have babies that survive after 25 weeks. So we don't make any of these calculations. What do? We ask the moil. The moil looks at the baby, and the moil decides whether or not this is a baby to do a bilan. Okay, I think we're going to stop over here. I was hoping to do a little bit further, but okay, we're going to stop over here, a little bit short of the page, but we will continue next time with Sefei. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua Sephorus, Parnas, and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Klal Tzedek, B'mherev Yameinu Amen. Be well.